Right now, in a concrete building surrounded by razor wire in the Arizona desert, 3 women are waiting to die. They are the only female inmates on Arizona's death row, confined to the Lumley Unit at Perryville Prison. Their crimes are almost too horrific to comprehend. A terminally ill husband poisoned and beaten to death. A 9-year-old girl shot in the face during a home invasion. A 10-year-old child locked in a storage box and left to suffocate in the brutal Arizona heat. These aren't characters from a horror film. These are real crimes committed by real women, and today, we're going to explore the chilling details of what led them to death row. Before we continue, kindly hit that subscribe button to be part of our growing community. On the night of October 7, 2000, Wendi Andriano and her husband Joe had what seemed like a normal family evening. They attended a backyard barbecue with their 2 small children, enjoying the pleasant fall weather in Ahwatukee, Arizona. They returned to their apartment around midnight and put the children to bed. But what happened in the hours that followed would transform Wendi from a suburban mother into one of the most notorious female killers in Arizona history. Joe Andriano was dying. He had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer that had slowly eaten away at his body for years. By 2000, doctors had given him about a year to live. He was 33 years old, weakened by chemotherapy, his body already beginning to fail. Wendi had become his caregiver, managing their apartment complex while raising 2 young children. But beneath the surface of this seemingly devoted wife, something dark was growing. At around 2:15 in the morning on October 8th, Wendi called a co-worker named Chris, who also lived in their apartment complex. She asked him to come watch the children because she needed to take Joe to the hospital. When Chris arrived, Wendi met him outside with words that would haunt him forever. She said her husband was on the floor dying, and she hadn't called 911 yet. When Chris urged her to make the call, he went outside to wait for the paramedics. When they arrived, something shocking happened. Wendi came screaming out of the apartment, telling them to leave. She claimed Joe had a do not resuscitate order and that it was his wish to die. The paramedics, following protocol, left the scene. 1 hour later, Wendi called 911 again. This time, when paramedics entered the apartment, they encountered a scene of unimaginable brutality. Joe Andriano lay in a massive pool of blood on the living room floor. His skull had been split open. A 13-inch knife protruded from his neck. Broken pieces of a bar stool and a shattered lamp surrounded his body. The medical examiner would later determine that Joe had been struck in the head 23 times with that bar stool, several of the blows individually fatal. But the horror didn't end there. When investigators searched the apartment, they found something chilling. Inside a bottle labeled as herbal supplements were gelatin capsules filled with sodium azide, a deadly chemical pesticide. Police traced the substance to Wendi's storage unit, where they found a 500-gram bottle with nearly 21 grams missing. Toxicology tests confirmed that Joe had sodium azide in his system. Wendi had been poisoning her dying husband, attempting to make his death look like a heart attack. During her trial, which lasted an excruciating 17 weeks, Wendi took the witness stand for 9 days. She claimed Joe had been physically and psychologically abusive. She said they had gotten into a fight after a failed assisted suicide attempt, and she defended herself by striking him with the bar stool. She claimed he had discovered her extramarital affair and became enraged, but prosecutors painted a very different picture. Evidence showed that in the months before Joe's murder, Wendi had been frequenting bars, drinking heavily, dancing with men, and carrying on multiple affairs. She had attempted to take out life insurance policies on her terminally ill husband, even asking friends to pose as Joe during pre-screening appointments. She had been seen aggressively pursuing men in her apartment complex, banging on doors in the middle of the night. None of Joe's friends or family had ever witnessed any abuse. In fact, Joe was so weakened by cancer and the sodium azide poisoning that he couldn't have defended himself even if he wanted to. The jury convicted Wendi of first-degree murder in November 2004, and she was sentenced to death the following month. She has been on death row for over 20 years, her appeals bouncing between state and federal courts. Today she remains at Lumley Unit, one of 3 women awaiting execution in Arizona. If Wendi Andriano's crime was calculated and methodical, the murders committed by Shawna Forde were explosive and driven by a twisted ideology. Shawna Forde was the self-proclaimed leader of a vigilante border patrol group called Minutemen American Defense. She was a woman with a troubled past who had found purpose, or perhaps delusion, in patrolling Arizona's border with Mexico. But maintaining her operation required money, and in 2009 she hatched a plan that would end in the deaths of an innocent father and his young daughter. On May 30, 2009, in the small desert community of Arivaca, Arizona, 29-year-old Raul Flores Jr. and his family were settling in for the night. Raul's wife Gina and their 9-year-old daughter Brisenia were home with him. Their older daughter was spending the night at her grandmother's house. Just before midnight there was a knock at the door. When Raul answered, he found people claiming to be law enforcement officers searching for fugitives. He let them inside. It was the last decision he would ever make. The people at the door were Shawna Forde and her accomplices, Jason Bush and Albert Gaxiola. They had come to rob the Flores family, believing the house contained drugs and money that Forde could use to fund her border vigilante group. Within moments of entering, Bush opened fire. Raul Flores was shot multiple times and fell to the floor. Gina was also shot, but, in a desperate act of survival, pretended to be dead. Then came the moment that would seal Shawna Forde's fate. 9-year-old Brisenia, awakened by the gunshots, emerged from her bedroom crying. She had seen her father shot. She saw her mother on the floor covered in blood. She was terrified and confused. And then Jason Bush raised his gun and shot the little girl in the face, killing her instantly. The intruders began ransacking the house, searching for the drugs and money they believed were hidden there. But Gina Gonzalez, though wounded and lying in her own blood, was not dead. She was listening. When she heard the intruders say they were coming back, she knew she had to act. Gina managed to reach a gun, and when the killers returned, she opened fire, wounding Jason Bush. The attackers fled into the night, and Gina called 911, her voice filled with terror and anguish as she reported that her daughter and husband had been shot. The 911 recording is almost unbearable to listen to. You can hear Gina's panic as she tells the operator that she pretended to be dead, that her daughter was crying before they shot her. When the operator asks if the shooters are still there, Gina screams that they're coming back in. The raw terror in her voice captures the nightmare that family experienced that night. Shawna Forde was arrested weeks later. During her trial, prosecutors revealed that she had planned the home invasion for months, meeting with militia members in Colorado and recruiting accomplices. Despite overwhelming evidence of her involvement, Forde showed no remorse. She maintained that she was innocent, that she had been set up, but the jury didn't believe her. One juror spoke to reporters after the trial, describing how difficult the deliberations had been. She said what haunted her most was the autopsy photograph of Brisenia Flores with half her face shot away. The jury sentenced Shawna Forde to death in February 2011. She was also given an additional 65 years in prison for attempted murder, burglary, and armed robbery. Today, she sits on death row, still claiming innocence, while the memory of a 9-year-old girl crying for her parents before being executed in her own home remains seared into the minds of everyone who heard the case. But perhaps no case on Arizona's female death row is as heartbreaking and infuriating as that of Sammantha Allen and the murder of 10-year-old Ame Deal. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was systematic, prolonged torture of a child who had nowhere to turn and no one to save her. Ame Deal was a tiny girl, just 4 feet 2 inches tall and 59 pounds. She lived in a crowded house in South Phoenix with her father, grandmother, Aunt Cynthia Stoltzman, who was her legal guardian, and her cousins Sammantha and John Allen, along with more than a dozen children. But Ame was treated differently than the other children in that house. She was singled out, targeted, and subjected to abuse that is almost impossible to comprehend. Neighbors would later tell investigators that they regularly saw Ame forced to walk back and forth on the scalding hot sidewalk, barefoot, in temperatures exceeding 114 degrees. She was beaten with a wooden paddle the family called the butt-buster. She was forced to eat hot sauce and dog feces. She was made to crush aluminum cans while barefoot. At night, as punishment for bedwetting, she was forced to sleep on the shower floor without any bedding. And when the adults in the house felt she needed to be punished more severely, they locked her inside a small plastic storage footlocker. On July 11, 2011, Ame was accused of stealing a popsicle. For this supposed crime, Sammantha and John Allen decided she needed to be punished. They forced the little girl to do jumping jacks, backbends and wall stands for hours in the sweltering Arizona heat that reached 103 degrees. Ame was exhausted, dehydrated, struggling to breathe. But the punishment wasn't over. That evening, the Allens brought out the footlocker, a plastic storage box that was 21 inches shorter than Ame's already tiny frame. They ordered another child in the house to drag the box inside. John Allen went to get a padlock, while Sammantha stood blocking the only exit from the room. When John returned with the padlock, he and Sammantha forced Ame into the box. Her small body had to be squeezed and contorted to fit into a space that was less than 3 feet long and only 1 foot wide and deep. Then they locked the box with the padlock, went to their bedroom, and fell asleep. Ame Deal died alone in that box, contorted in an impossible position, unable to move, unable to breathe, in a non-air-conditioned room in Phoenix during the summer. She suffocated to death, with heat exhaustion and dehydration as contributing factors. When police arrived the next morning after the family finally called 911, they found Ame lying in a curled position inside the box. Her lips were discolored. She was lying in her own urine and sweat. She had been dead for hours. Initially, the adults in the house claimed that Ame had been playing hide-and-seek and accidentally locked herself in the box. But other family members came forward and told authorities the truth. They had seen Ame locked in that box before as punishment. They knew what had really happened. Investigators soon discovered the full extent of the abuse Ame had endured. Child Protective Services records from previous states where the family had lived documented concerns about abuse and neglect, about disgusting living conditions. But somehow, Ame had fallen through the cracks, and no one had saved her. Sammantha Allen was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. During her trial, prosecutors detailed the horrific abuse Ame had suffered. The defense argued that Sammantha had been raised in an unstable, impoverished home ruled by her mother and grandmother, that she too had been a victim of abuse and circumstance. They suggested that Ame had been treated differently because there were questions about whether her father was actually her biological father, that the family had scapegoated the little girl. But none of that excused what Sammantha had done. None of that brought Ame back. The jury found Sammantha Allen guilty of first-degree murder in June 2017. During the penalty phase, they heard testimony about Sammantha's difficult upbringing, about the cycles of abuse that had shaped her life. But they also saw photographs of Ame, smiling and innocent, a child who never had a chance. In August 2017, the jury sentenced Sammantha Allen to death. She also received 74 years in prison for child abuse and conspiracy charges. Her husband, John Allen, was also convicted and sentenced to death. Ame's grandmother received 10 years in prison. Her legal guardian, Cynthia Stoltzman, received 24 years. Today, Sammantha Allen sits on death row at Lumley Unit, the same facility that houses Wendi Andriano and Shawna Forde. She is one of only 3 women facing execution in Arizona and one of just 55 women on death row nationwide, compared to nearly 2,800 men. These 3 women, 3 very different people who committed 3 very different crimes, now share the same fate. They wait in isolation, confined to cells in the Arizona desert, knowing that one day the state may carry out their death sentences. Arizona has resumed executions after a multi-year pause, and though these women's appeals continue to wind through the courts, the possibility of execution is very real. Their crimes leave us with haunting questions. How does a wife poison and bludgeon her dying husband? How does someone orchestrate a home invasion that ends with a 9-year-old girl being shot in the face? How does a family torture a child to death and then sleep peacefully while she suffocates in a locked box? These are questions that may never have satisfying answers. These 3 women on Arizona's death row remind us that evil doesn't always look like we expect it to. It can wear the face of a suburban mother, a political activist, or a young woman who was herself once a child. And the victims they left behind, the families forever shattered, the children who never got to grow up, they are the ones we must never forget.